So you know what's a really fun deck type? Reanimator. And you know what's fun about Reanimator? You can basically shove whatever you want into it. So one of the deck types that brought me back into playing Commander at all was Reanimator. Specifically, it was Sephiroth's dungeon deck, and falling in love with the idea of cheating out creatures really made me enjoy Commander way more than I was trying to enjoy it when I had my Freyalise precon. That said, most of that's probably because I come from Yu-Gi-Oh! And Call the Haunted, Premature Burial, and Monster Reborn being the trifecta of value is just kind of a thing I grew up with, so it's familiar territory for me. That all said, while commanders like Sephiroth are fun for me because they are commanders that do the reanimation themselves, and Sauron is also a commander that does the reanimation himself, sometimes you need to build a deck where none of those engines are present in the command zone, but nonetheless, the deck is still going to be doing its job, and doing its job very powerfully. Let's talk about Vohar, Vidalian Desecrator. Vohar Vidalian Desecrator is a 2-mana 1/2 Phyrexian Merfolk Wizard, that is a mouthful, that has a very particular ability. You can tap it to draw a card and discard a card. There's other text written on this. I'm sure that other text matters sometimes. I'm pretty sure part of that text may even say you can get rid of your commander to cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. I'm fairly certain all of that is written on this card, but realistically, the real reason we are playing this is because it's a Dimir commander that costs an itty-bitty amount of mana, and it lets us discard cards from our hand. That is the reason we are playing Vohar today. So, let's go ahead and get into the core strategy of what we are going to be trying to accomplish with this dude. Ultimately, we want to be reanimating creatures from our graveyard, and in order to do that, they need to make their way into our graveyard. So our commander has a very simple job. That is, be on the board long enough to throw one of these creatures into the graveyard, and then if our opponents kill our commander, whoopsie doodle, who the hell cares? It didn't matter in the first place. The game was rigged from the start. So, let's talk about some of our reanimation targets and why these are going to be things that our opponents are not going to want to deal with. First of all, Ulamog's Crusher. An 8-mana 8/8 is normally not easy to drop onto the board, and with Annihilator 2, this thing can start eating things away from your opponent's boards, and in the case of it happening after a board wipe, this will eventually just start crushing their lands as well. Ulamog's Crusher is a very hard card to contend with, but because we are going to be playing it for, well, not a lot of mana at all, it's going to be a very, very powerful swingy card for us. And we have a second copy of it that Wizards of the Coast misprinted and called Breaker of Creation that has other text on it, but I'm pretty sure that 8 power and Annihilator 2 are all that I really care about on this card. Speaking of Eldrazi, let's also put a Breaker of Armies in, because there's nothing more funny than making all of your opponent's creatures block the Breaker of Armies so that other gigantic creatures can make it through and turn their life total into something more resembling their bank account balance. I mean, let's be honest, we play Magic the Gathering, money is not a luxury most of us have anymore. Let's also throw in some obnoxiously big creatures to reanimate like Ancient Stone Idol, which even has a really quirky ability where if our opponents kill it, we get to make a 6/12 creature with trample to replace it, so it's kind of a sticky card. It's hard to get rid of. Let's also add in some massive game-swinging cards like Diluvian Primordial and Sepulchre Primordial. Both of these allow us to reanimate either instants and sorceries or creatures from our opponent's graveyards, giving us either instant board states or sometimes instant win conditions depending on the combination of cards we steal from our opponents. Let's also throw in a Sphinx of the Second Sun. This card puts in far more work than its meager text would imply. It's got flying, and it effectively gives you an extra opening step at the end of your turn. You basically get to say, hey, my turn's ending, therefore I'm untapping my cards and drawing a card. But because we're playing Dimir colors, this means that we always get to do things like hold up counter spells for removal. We also get to do very, very fun things like always draw extra cards that our commander will then toss into the graveyard. Honestly, Sphinx just does a ton of work. Then we have the Mind Leech Mass. When this deals combat damage to a player, we get to look at their hand and cast any spell from among them without paying that spell's mana cost. This is a massive tempo swing in a lot of situations, as people mulligan out their hands to sculpt the plays they want to do in future turns. If we can take those plays from them early, we are going to be in a very, very good spot. Scholar of the Lost Trove is also fantastic. When it enters the battlefield, we get to cast any instant, sorcery, or artifact card from our graveyard without paying its mana cost. Now, the big thing we're going to be doing with this is reanimating the Scholar of the Lost Trove and then using the Scholar to recast a reanimation spell from our graveyard. This will almost always mean that we will be in the dominant position board state-wise because we get free shit. And if you really want dominant board states, I'm going to go ahead and show you one of the things we're going to be casting with this. It may be skipping ahead a bit, but if you cast a Necromantic Selection using this Sphinx's ability, then this will wipe the entire board, and then the Sphinx will automatically reanimate because of the Necromantic Selection, allowing you to grab any instant or sorcery from your graveyard and cast it if you want. Again, you may lose your Necromantic Selection for the rest of the game, but honestly, board wiping and then saying I have the two strongest creatures on the board for the next 3 or 4 turn cycles is a very, very powerful play. Then we have Scion of Darkness. When this deals combat damage to a player, we can put any creature card from their graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. And in the unlikely event our commander is not out, we can cycle the Scion of Darkness to its own ability in order to get it into the graveyard, even if we are not able to throw it in with our commander. Now, our deck is not going to function without a lot of reanimation spells, and so we are running 11 of them so that more than a tenth of our deck is dedicated to hitting these cards. If you use a geometric calculator for the deck, you'll notice that this means that we will draw at least one of these reanimation spells in about the first 4 turns of the game. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the cards we are running. We have a Coiling Rebirth. We can return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield, and then we get to clone that creature if we give somebody a card, just letting them have a draw so that we get 2 of our best creatures. The secondary one's going to be a 1/1, but come on, that's still pretty good. Diabolic Servitude is a 4-mana reanimation spell that if they don't get rid of the spell itself and instead just get rid of the creature via board wipe or something, the Servitude goes back to our hand and we get to use it again on other creatures. The only downside is we do have to exile the creature afterwards, but honestly, that's a very small price to pay for a recursion engine we get to repeat. Then we have Doomed Necromancer, which can sacrifice itself to reanimate a thing from our grave, Dread Return, which can reanimate a thing from the grave and also Flashback if we sack 3 creatures, Restart Sequence, which can reanimate from the grave, and it can lower its cost if we happen to punch somebody with our commander, Geth Summons, which reanimates a creature from the grave, and then if opponents have poison counters, you get an extra effect, which will matter if you are playing that one degenerate who really likes playing Skitherix in your casual games. Then we have From the Catacombs. This reanimates a creature from the grave and then gives you the initiative. Then that means we get to have a fun little mini-game. The initiative works a lot like Monarch in that it forces us to have a little token that passes around the board depending on who has dealt combat damage to the player who has the initiative last. And of course, the way the initiative functions is it puts us into the Undercity. If we are in the Undercity, we start at the very first room, searching our library for a basic land card. And then afterwards, we get to pick and choose which way we want to go down the Undercity. We are a Reanimator deck, so it is very likely we're going to want to go down the Forge in order to make one of our Reanimated creatures that much stronger, pushing that value even further. And then as we go further into the dungeon, we're going to want to do traps so that a player loses 5 life. Our deck's win condition is attrition and combat damage, so we want to try to get to that end goal as fast as possible. Next, the only option we have is going to the archives, and finally we hit the Throne of the Dead 3, which will allow us to get a creature out of our deck for free onto the battlefield with 3/1/1 counters and temporary hexproof. Also noteworthy is the fact that From the Catacombs has an escape ability so that we can cast it from the graveyard again if need be. Then we have Ever After, which can reanimate 2 creatures from our graveyard at once. Victimize, which can do the same thing for the low cost of sacrificing a creature. Zombify, which can reanimate a creature at a very low cost of 4. And then finally a Yawgmoth's Vile Offering. This allows us to put any target creature or planeswalker from our graveyard onto the battlefield, but we also get to blow up any creature an opponent controls when we do so, letting us not only get a powerful creature, but remove a threat from the board at the same time. Finally, reanimation decks tend to love clones, because what's better than one great value creature? Multiple copies of the value creature. So we have Vizier of Many Faces, Copy Crook, Mirror Image, and we have Body Double. All of these allow us to copy a creature that is on the battlefield, or in the case of Body Double, copy a creature in the graveyard. The superfluous text on the cards are pretty much just that. Sometimes they will matter, sometimes they won't. Copy Crook is notable because it does have Connive, and Vizier of Many Faces can be used from the graveyard because of Embalm, but most of the time these are just going to be 4 mana extra copies of whatever we like. The last copy card we have, though, is the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer. This card gives us the initiative as well, and allows us to copy the second spell we cast any turn. This means if we go, say, play a Mana Rock and then play a reanimation spell, we will then be able to get 2 copies of that, reanimating a lot of things from our graveyard. In the event that we have finished a dungeon, then the Tomb of Horrors Adventurer will activate that spell twice instead of once. So we will get 3 copies of that spell instead of 2 copies of that spell. So we will get 3 reanimation spells when we cast one. Tomb of Horrors Adventurer is a fantastic card to reanimate, and it's a fantastic card to play on curve. Honestly, the way this card can contort games into your favor is fantastic in my book. And that does it for the core of the deck. We want to reanimate big things, and we want to clone those big things so we have more of those big things so that our opponents die to our big things. And now that we're done talking about really awkward innuendo, let's go ahead and talk about stopping our opponents from playing anything they want. I lied. We got to talk about draw engines, and we can't just rely on our commander for this one. Let's go ahead and run a 9-card draw engine. Of course, our 10th card is our commander. And let's start off with the basic draw cards. Memory Deluge lets us look at the top X cards of our library, where X is its cost, put 2 of them in our hand and the other on the bottom of the library. This also has flashback, so if we have it in the grave, it will be able to use its ability again. 2 cards that are very like Memory Deluge are the new Stock Up from Aether Drift. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 in your hand and the others on the bottom. And then we have Dig Through Time, which lets us look at the top 7 cards, put 2 in our hand, and the rest on the bottom. And it has Delve, so any cards we don't need that have been stuck in our graveyard, maybe cards we've thrown in there with our commander, Dig Through Time can see those and then be cast for less in so doing. Then we have Factor Fiction, which lets us look at the top 5 cards of our library, throw them at an opponent, and make them separate those cards into 2 piles. We then pick a pile, put it in our hand, and the other pile goes to the graveyard, meaning we just pick whatever we want to reanimate and throw that shit away. Speaking of reanimate, we can reanimate Baleful Force. At the beginning of each upkeep, we get to draw an extra card and lose a life. This means that by the end of a turn cycle, we will be able to draw 4 cards with the Baleful Force, and then of course our 5th card when our turn comes around. This means that if nobody deals with the Baleful Force, we are digging through our deck at such a rate that we will be ahead of all of our opponents in every perceivable way. Then we have some lieutenants, Merfolk Looter and Obsessive Stitcher. These are both doing the same job as our commander, but the Obsessive Stitcher does it with one little bit of added flair. She is herself a reanimation spell. Then we have Wind Reader Sphinx. Whenever a creature with flying attacks, we are allowed to draw a card. This 3/7 Sphinx can be used to put pressure on opponents, but primarily it is here to make sure that we are always having lots of cards in our hand, and of course, whenever the Sphinx swings, we are going to draw those cards as well. If an opponent happens to be using a dragon deck, or any type of flying deck, or hell, even using a Baleful Strix or a Hornet Queen, Wind Reader Sphinx will be able to get us lots of value as players try to use those pieces on their boards. And that does it for our draw engine. We are leaning very heavily on what our commander does, yes, but I think we should be able to do that pretty handedly. That said, let's go ahead and talk about the next section of the deck, which is, well, honestly one of my favorites, because I love talking about removal. Not counting board wipes, we are going to be running a 14-card removal suite. And let's go ahead and get right into it. We are running a handful of counter spells. We've got a negate to counter any non-creature spell. We have a refute to counter any spell and then allow us to draw and discard, which of course our deck loves to do. We have Find the Villain's Lair, which allows us to counter a spell, and then if we choose, we can then draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards with its effect if we want to do that instead. Most of the time we're going to hold this up as a counter spell, but sometimes we will need need to get new things in the graveyard, like if we happen to suffer a Bojuka Bog. Next, we have a Get Out, which can be used to counter creature or enchantment spells, or we can use it to put 2 of our creatures or enchantments back into our hand. Most of the time, we'll use this to reset creatures with powerful ETBs that we want to reanimate to get effects of them again. And speaking of those creatures with powerful ETBs, we have Voracious Fellbeast. This card makes all of our opponents sacrifice a creature, and then we get foods for all the creatures that they sack. We also have Vile Mutilator, which makes all of our opponents sacrifice a creature and an enchantment, and we also have Baleful Beholder, which makes all of our opponents sacrifice an enchantment. We'll also have Dusk Mangler in here, which makes all of our opponents sacrifice a creature, discard a card, and lose 4 life when it enters the battlefield. And we also get Archfiend of Ilfnir, which says when we cycle or discard cards, which of course we'll be doing a lot of with our commander, we put a -1/-1 counter on every creature that our opponents control. We'll also throw in a Gormond in here, which makes all of our opponents sacrifice a creature when it enters the battlefield. Then for targeted removal, let's put an Overseer of the Damned in here. It blows up a creature when it comes out, and of course, anytime a non-token creature dies on our opponent's board, we get to make 2/2 zombies with that, which means we can get that much closer to winning the game with those. We can also use a Noxious Gearhulk to blow up a creature, and then of course, it has a big menace body. It can help close out games, but it also lets us get life, which means we can survive more aggro-heavy matchups or decks that have, say, like Perforos commanders. This allows us to dig out of bad situations with those decks. Then we have more targeted removal in the form of Feed the Swarm and Resculpt. Both of these get rid of an creature or an artifact or an enchantment, depending on which color you are looking at. Both of these are fantastic includes in any deck that can fit them, as long as you are not running a deck that, has better options because of its colors. For instance, you don't really want to run Feed the Swarm in a deck that has green in it and can use the more versatile green removal. It's just not really great when you have better options. But in Dimir, it is perfectly reasonable. Then we have the aforementioned Necromantic Selection, blow up all creatures, reanimate a creature that was blown up this way. Sometimes we can use this to get our ETBs again, but a lot of times we can use this to just steal our opponent's commanders and hold on to them for safekeeping. There's a timing restriction on Necromantic Selection that prevents our opponents from moving commanders to the command zone in response to them being sent to the graveyard by Necromantic Selection before the selection is able to steal a creature. Then we have Consuming Tide, which makes everybody bounce of all their non-land permanents to their hands, except for a single non-land permanent they control. Because we are a Reanimator deck, we are likely going to have the strongest non-land permanent on the board because we cheated that thing out like 5 turns ago. Come on, you weren't paying attention, right? We definitely dropped Tomb of Horrors Adventure out like ages ago, and it's just been giving us value. That all said, that does it for all of our removal. That should allow us to stay ahead of our opponents very late into the game. But now that we're done with all that, let's go ahead and talk about mana. Our commander comes out early, so we don't have need for a ton of ramp, but we do still want to have some in case we have to hard cast some of our good creatures. So we are going to be running the 2 mana rocks of Sky Diamond and Charcoal Diamond, as well as Fractured Power Stone and Dimir Signet. All of these are doing the same job, just being generic 2 mana rocks that do good work. Then we have Wayfarer's Bauble, because it is the safest form of ramp available for us in any color, really. And then finally, we have a Command Sphere, since we can sack it to draw cards later in the game, and an Honored Heirloom, since we can use this to get rid of cards in our opponent's graveyards. We are going to be wanting to hold up our instant speed spells, and we are going to be wanting to make sure that we are spending as little mana as possible, since we are planning on using mostly Reanimates to get cards out. Ideally, this means we should have mana to spare for things like Honored Heirloom, disrupting decks like Marin of Clan Neltoth basically every turn. Then for lands, we're going to be running 12 swamps and 9 islands, as our deck does lean further into black. And for our multiple dual lands, we are going to be running a Command Tower, a Choked Estuary, a Darkwater Catacombs, a Sunken Temple, a Tainted Isle, a River of Tears. That will be all of our non-tapped lands. For our tapped lands, we'll run a Fetid Pools, so that we can get rid of it if we need to draw an extra card, Temple of Deceit, so we can hopefully draw it early and scry, and a Dimir Aqueduct, so that we can bounce a powerful land to our hand in case we need to reuse it. Then for fetching lands, we are going to be running Escape Tunnel, Terramorphic Expanse, and Evolving Wilds. These are all basically the same card. And Ash Barrens to cycle for whatever land we need, and a Myriad Landscape, which we can use to grab whatever lands we need and ramp up as well. Then for utility lands, let's run a Takassia's Dig Site, since we can use this to surveil good creatures to the grave, a Port of Karfell, because we can use this to reanimate good creatures, Pit of Offerings, which can be used to get rid of creatures from our opponent's graves, which is very good to reuse with Dimir Aqueduct. Then we have a Volatile Fall, which can be used to get rid of problematic lands, like say Glacial Chasm or Maze's End, and an Ominous Cemetery, which can be used to get rid of our opponent's creatures if we ever need to have a land get rid of creatures, which, you know, for, what, 7 cents is a really reasonable rate for saying, hey, I don't like that you're swinging at me with that dragon. Fuck that dragon, except not like that, you weirdo. That said, that does it for everything that's in the deck, and if you enjoyed it, then maybe consider checking out my other videos, and maybe consider checking out my Patreon, and all that other fun stuff. But, before you do that, the video's not over. We still gotta talk about how to play this damn thing. I'm gonna be honest, as long as I have a way to reanimate a creature and a creature that I want to reanimate in my opening hand, I'm pretty much set for the game. And this opening hand has a Breaker of Creation, a reanimation play in the form of Obsessive Stitcher, and a bunch of lands. So I think we're gonna go ahead and keep it. We draw a Wayfarer's Bauble to start out. Let's go ahead and play that Bauble and pass the turn. Next turn, we have a From the Catacombs. Perfect. We have a new reanimation spell we can use. Let's go ahead and play an island, tap 1, 2, and let's get Vohar out. Next turn, it is turn 3, and I think the correct move is to play this Escape Tunnel and crack it along with the Wayfarer's Bauble to get 2 lands out of our deck. Then, as we pass to our opponents, let's go ahead and tap Vohar to draw a singular card and discard a card. I think the Vile Mutilator would set our opponents back the most this early in the game, so let's go ahead and go with that. We move into turn 4, and we can go ahead and play a Swamp, and let's go ahead and drop that Vile Mutilator right onto the board, setting back all of our opponents' turns pretty heavily. We cast From the Catacombs, and then we get to go ahead and put the Mutilator out. Boom, they have lost important pieces, and we get the initiative. Now that we are in a very good spot, let's go ahead and tap Vohar to draw a free card and toss that Breaker of Creation away. Then our opponents have their turn, and if they don't deal with the Vile Mutilator when our turn comes up, we get to add a counter to the Undercity, which allows us to put 2 1/1 counters onto our Vile Mutilator, making it now an 8/7 that is able to swing for a decent chunk of players' health pools. Not 78, what am I doing? Why is Moxfield so clunky sometimes? There we go, boom. Now that we've drawn a Copy Crook, I think the move is going to be to play a Swamp, tap 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll play the Copy Crook as a copy of the Vile Mutilator, getting rid of even more creatures and more setup enchantments from our opponents. This sets our opponents back even further and puts us in a very good spot. And if there is a problematic creature that we weren't able to hit with these, let's go ahead and use Feed the Swarm to eat that out as well. We have now total gotten rid of 13 permanents from all of our opponents. We move into the next turn, and we get to tick the Throne of the Dead 3. That allows us another form of life removal from our opponents. Let's go ahead and drop down the Temple of Deceit. Look at the top card of our deck. It's an Ever After. I do want that Ever After, so we're going to tap Vohar, draw the Ever After, discarding the Voracious Fellbeast, and then we're going to go ahead and tap out in order to do the silly play. We play the Ever After, summoning the Voracious Fellbeast and summoning the Breaker of Creation. This goes back into the bottom of our library, and then we get to look at our opponents and say, hey, do you want to sacrifice a creature again, meaning we've knocked out 16 permanents from the board? And oh, by the way, we have a Breaker of Creation now that is an 8/4 that we can use to start punking your life totals. Then we punch them with the Vile Mutilators and hit for a combined total of, what are they hitting for right now? 14 damage. Ouch, take 14. Life sucks for you. I am very sorry. We are a Reanimator control deck. This is just how things go. The Undercity gets to tick up again, drawing us an extra card for our next turn, and it's a Wind Rider Sphinx. I really want that Wind Rider Sphinx to come down, but I want to be able to hold up the Refute, given that we have had some interesting turns happen. So let's go ahead and tap the Vohar, draw an extra card. We've drawn a Mirror Image, so let's ditch the Wind Rider Sphinx. Let's pay 1, 2, 3. Mirror Image comes down as another copy of the Vile Mutilator, getting rid of even more cards from our opponent's boards. And now, when our opponents try to do anything to stop us, we are going to tap 3, and we are going to cast Refute to stop whatever card we do not like, drawing us an extra card and letting us discard a card. Now that we've done that, we get to move on to the penultimate turn of turn 8. We get one more tick of Throne of the Dead 3. Let's go ahead and see what free creature we get from the Throne of the Dead 3. Already, I'm liking the option of Sphinx of the Second Sun, but I think Tomb of Horrors Adventurer is probably the one I'm going to be grabbing first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep, Tomb of Horrors Adventurer is the one I'm going to grab, and it's going to give me the initiative again, which is going to give me that swamp and give me a free deck shuffle. So the Villain's Lair was something we never actually drew. We get to shuffle our library, and we get to draw our actual card for turn, which is a fact or fiction. So now what we're going to do is we are going to tap Vohar, draw a card. We see we have Find the Villain's Lair. We don't need Find the Villain's Lair, so let's go ahead and toss Swamp away. We'll hold on to Find the Villain's Lair in case we need to get rid of anything really, really good. And let's dig through our deck to get ourselves a reanimation spell. Let's pay 2, because we are going to be able to delve a lot. We are getting rid of 1, 2, 3. We want to keep the Windrider Sphinx. 4. We want to keep this. 5, 6. All of these go into exile. And we get to use Dig Through Time as our first spell for turn, letting us look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cards, and we get to put 2 into our hand. The Sphinx of Athun is already a really nice card, as it does give us a Fact or Fiction style ability, so maybe that's the one we grab. We could also, I think we grab that and the Breaker of Armies. Let's grab those 2, and the rest of these can go to the bottom of the deck. Now, our second spellcast is going to be copied multiple times. Unfortunately for us, we don't actually have anything we can do at this very moment. We do have the board dominant position, so I think the second spellcast is going to be tapping 1, 2, 3, 4, playing Fact or Fiction, and this is where we get to play Russian roulette with everybody. We get to hand every single person a stack of 5 cards and say, hey, of these 5 cards, which one do you want me to have? And we get to do it for each of our opponents. This is a nutty thing to put on our opponents. What combination of reanimation spells or reanimation targets would you like me to have? Oh God, I hope you don't put them into the same piles. That would be terribly inconvenient for me. I sincerely hope you don't give me more draw power with stock up that I can clone with Tomb of Horrors Adventurer. Nobody is gonna have a good time when we hand them 3 copies of Fact or Fiction and say, everybody pick your poison. I get a gigantic hand, and I don't need a reliquary tower because I want half of these things in my graveyard. And I will be cheating them out, and life is going to be painful and miserable for all of you. I apologize. But that does it for the demonstration of the deck. That would put us in a very hefty game dominant position, and it was all on the back of Vohar, allowing us to discard our cards as early as possible and as reliably as possible. And if we didn't like where things went with that, remember that Fact or Fiction puts the extra cards in the graveyard. We could use Vohar to recast some of the cards that we would throw into the graveyard. Notably, if we got rid of things like Yawgmoth's Vile Offering, we would be able to recast that and get rid of problematic cards from our opponents. All things considered, we are in a very, very dominant position with the game state here. But what would you do if you wanted to increase the power of this deck ever so slightly by making it a bit more expensive than a $15 deck? If you are upgrading this deck, there are 2 forms of upgrades that you can go for. You can make your reanimation spells more efficient, and you can make your creatures that you are reanimating more efficient. So, In lieu of that, let's go ahead and look at the first set of those. Soul Exchange is a great reanimation spell, makes you sacrifice a creature and then reanimate any creature you have here. A prime target for this sometimes is just sacrificing our own Vohar, because we don't really need him after he served his purpose. Then we have Reanimate itself, which we can use. It's just 1 mana and does its job. We can also add in a Stitch Together, since we will easily hit the threshold cost for Stitch Together. And for our Haymaker reanimation spells, let's go ahead and toss in a Rise of the Dark Realms to reanimate everything in our graveyard all at once, including all of our opponent's cards, and a Breach the Multiverse to fill everybody's graveyards and get a bunch of creatures out immediately as well. Next, for creatures that are going to be far more impactful to your games, let's go ahead and get rid of some of our ETB creatures and replace them with cards like Shieldred the Whispering One, which both reanimates creatures from our grave and also gets rid of creatures from our opponent's boards very, very often. We can also selectively remove things from our opponent's boards by using Shadowgrange Archfiend so that we can get rid of a very, very powerful set of creatures instead of just any creature at all. We also get life gain for this as well. We can get a creature that board wipes with a Massacre Worm. We can get more reanimation with Ancient Brass Dragon. We can also make sure that our opponents are forever pressured by reanimating an Archon of Cruelty. And we can also add in a Nezahal Primal Tide, as this gives us such a gigantic advantage engine, and Nezahal is just really hard to get rid of as well. Finally, as you are upgrading any deck, remember to increase your utility land count. Adding in a lot of MDFCs will make the deck way more versatile and way more powerful, and cards like Fel the Profane are some of the greatest examples of MDFCs in recent years. And that really does it for everything in the deck. Ideally, you guys enjoyed. I think that this deck is a very, very powerful engine of control and destruction, but if you happen to not want the deck in its current form, there are plenty of other reanimation decks that I've built that are in a very, very similar line, but will give you some more powerful outputs. This one is more of a, let's have an engine in the command zone, and if it dies, it dies. Very much in the style of my Ruby deck. That said, if you haven't already, please consider following me over on Blue Sky. And of course, if you're over there, then you'll be able to see announcements for whenever I'm going live. Because Monday through Thursday, I do have a live stream where I play World of Warcraft, talk about current events, and yes, I will also be talking about Magic the Gathering over there. That's on twitch.com/NecoSuris and YouTube/SurisLive. Obviously, if you want to support my channel, there is a Patreon as well, and of course, there is a playmat if you want to represent the channel at your local game store, which I would greatly appreciate as well. And if you do have a playmat, then go ahead and send me a picture in Discord or throw it on Blue Sky of you playing at your local game store with your brand new mat, and I will definitely appreciate it. That all said, thank you all for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you that allow me to do what I do over here on YouTube on all of my channels. That all said, thank you for watching. As always, everybody, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I really could not do any of this without all of you. Those of you watching, and especially those of you who support me on Patreon. I wanted to go ahead and take a minute to thank all of you who do that, because with YouTube being what it is these days, I really cannot do this full time without the support from each and every one of you. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravelern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Tales of Atonement, Nixie Chan, Kiri Artemis, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fireshard. Thank you so very much. But since you're here, why not go ahead and try watching another one? There should be one that's on the screen right now. And if you are a patron of mine, I wanted to go ahead and thank you again for all of your support. There is still a video you could press though, if you'd like. I would appreciate it just a little bit.